Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, I'm delighted to welcome a neuroscientist to the Storybox. Always love having neuroscientists on the show. Today, my friends, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Amishi Jha. Now, for those of you that don't know who she is, she's a professor of psychology at the University of Miami. Already jealous because she's in Miami, one of my favorite places to go, even though I haven't been there. She serves as the Director of Contemplative Neuroscience. Sorry if I got that wrong, for the Mindfulness Research and Practice Initiative, which she co-founded in 2010. She received her Ph.D. from the University of California, Davis, and postdoctoral training at the Brain Imaging and Analysis Center at Duke University. So she's very well qualified. Dr. Jha's work has been featured at NATO, the World Economic Forum. She's been covered in the New York Times, NPR, Time, Forbes, many others. She's got a TED Talk, which had well over 5 million views. It's incredible. You should go check it out. It's called How to Tame Your Wandering Mind. She's got a new book coming out, which I am very excited to speak more about with her today. It's called Peak Mind. It comes on sale October 19th. So around the time that this episode drops, so go and get a copy right now. It's going to be a great conversation. Dr. Jha, can I welcome you so much to the Storybox podcast today?
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. And like I was just telling you a moment ago, I love having neuroscientists on the show. I love diving into science, even though I sucked at it in high school. I am much more interested and well-versed in it now, I hope. And I love asking questions revolving the brain, peak performance, how we can optimize our own selves to become better as human beings. So really grateful that you took the time to be here today. Before we dive officially into your backstory, your new book, all the amazing things, I have one question that I normally love asking all my guests at the very start, which is, what does success look like for you?
That's a good one. So to me, success is not only performing in an excellent manner, meaning achieving my goals, but doing it with some care and kindness for myself in the process.
When did you discover that this was success for you? Has it been this gradual thing over time, or was it more of a catalyst moment somewhere?
Oh, the second piece is definitely new. And what I realized is if we just try to push ourselves without that component of self-reflection, self-awareness, and even essentially self-care, though I don't usually use that phrase, we're going to burn out, and nothing we do will actually benefit anyone if we are spent out and sort of angry at the whole process.
Mm-hmm. So talking about self-reflection in terms of why people don't normally do self-reflection, why is that not a normal habit that people have in their life, you think?
I think it goes to the bigger topic that I think we'll dive into, which is where our attention tends to go. And once we're done with the action, it's very rare that we're going to actually look back to say, what was my mind during all of this? Where was I actually during the process of whatever action that just transpired, even if I led the action? So doing that ends up being a very useful bonus tool that we can add to our toolkit.
Before we dive further into the bigger topic, I'm curious about how you got started in psychology, neuroscience, these sorts of fields. Was this something that you always wanted to study?
Kind of and kind of not. I thought while I was growing up, I'm an Indian woman living in the US. Some level I thought I was supposed to be a doctor. Like all Indian women are either doctors or Indian people. Many tend to be doctors, accountants, computer software engineers, et cetera. So it always felt like there was just some predisposition I had to go do this thing called being a medical doctor. And to the point where I actually started volunteering in a hospital because I thought that was going to be my life path. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I discovered there was no way I was doing that. I mean, it was just not for me. I commend the people that want to do that kind of work. But to me, it felt like I just didn't want to be around sickness, and I didn't want to explore solutions for people. I was much more interested in sort of how things worked. And one of the posts that I had in my volunteer time was in the brain injury unit. And that sort of really woke me up. It was like all my interest in the mind and really some kind of latent interest in psychology at some level connected with this topic of brain, and the brain that can change and heal itself and transform itself. So working in the working in the brain injury unit allowed me a window into seeing people actually change their own brains, actually
Mm.
recover from severe brain injury. And then I was kind of hooked. Then I went on to do an undergrad degree in neuroscience and a PhD, and then have not really looked back or stopped since. So it went from medicine to really basic science having to do with the mind and brain.
Was there anything, is something that I'm curious about, was there anything that sort of came across as confronting to you when you looked at the brain and how the brain works and brain injury?
Well, for brain injury in particular, it was that so much of recovery is about practicing the kinds of skills that we've lost, even mentally.
Mm.
So, for example, even those early days when I'd first started volunteering at the hospital, there was this patient that I thought was a quadriplegic. He could not, it was a terrible motorcycle accident, couldn't move any of his limbs. And my job as the low level volunteer was to just take him outside for some fresh air. So initially there was this very large kind of contraption that was like kind of a wheelchair that would allow full access for me moving him around. And then eventually it was almost like one day I got there and he was moving himself around in a new wheelchair, just using a part of his hand. And I was like, this is amazing. I didn't know that, I didn't tell him this, but I was like, I didn't know that you were able to do this. And then he kind of shared with me that even he would do physical therapy all day, but then at night when he was, you know, going to bed, essentially, he said, I would just envision, he said to me, I'm envisioning myself pushing the lever over and over again. And that's helping me train my brain.
Mm.
And that was like amazing to me. Now, of course, as somebody who's been in this field for a long time and who works with people that are interested in performance psychology, et cetera, this is a very common mental training technique. Golfers will visualize their swing, or, baseball players throwing the pitch, or whatever it is, you can rehearse it in your mind and find that it actually benefits actual performance. So
Mm.
that piece was very exciting. The other piece that would just to add on to that I find very still thrilling, um, is that the adult brain can grow new neurons, and that we can not only recover from injury, but we can actually rewire our own brain through mental exercise to optimize our own performance. And in particular, for me, it was an interest in how we might train our attention to be stronger and more resilient.
Let me come back to, because if I was to ask you the question how we can do that, I feel like we'll be going on for ages because it's a massive question, because there's a lot,
Yeah.
lot to unpack there. But I wanted to go into, I guess, the idea of for us or for me, someone that hasn't really studied the brain that much, I guess we've been told a certain thing about how powerful the brain really is. And I want to go on thinking that my brain is incredibly powerful. I'm super smart. I'm a genius, blah, 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 which is probably not the case, right? But anyway, I wanted to ask you, just how powerful would you say is an average brain compared to that of a genius's brain? Or is there any distinction at all?
Ooh. Well, at some level, our our brain is kind of an amazing thing, right? I mean, it's got so much complexity to it. And it was interesting. My son recently asked me, do you think you'll ever, he's 19, he's a college student, so he's asking all kinds of annoying questions to his professor mom. Now that he's used to doing that at school. But he said, will you ever understand the full complexity of the brain in your lifetime?
Mm.
And I said, no way. And he said, well, do you think, he kind of pushed it beyond that. He's like, do you think you'll ever understand, you meaning the entirety of the human being, at any point in time? Do you think we'll ever understand the nature of the brain? And I still was like, I don't really know if that's going to happen, because at some level we're going to be bound by our own blindness because we're looking at ourselves.
Yeah.
And then, of course, his response was like, well, then why bother? Right? Why are you bothering to it? But of course, to me, that is the journey. That is the excitement, because if we can take what we perceive as the most complex thing that exists and start understanding its power, its vulnerability, its trainability, then there's a lot to learn there that I think is not only intrinsically interesting, but actually can advantage people. So I
Mm.
guess I'm not so interested in how an ordinary brain versus a genius brain may differ. I'm more interested in how certain functions like attention can recalibrate the way the whole thing works moment by moment.
Mm.
And regardless of what our particular set point is regarding our intelligence or our disposition, we all have the capacity to enhance and alter ourselves. So that's more sort of my orientation.
So speaking more in line with your son's question, which is something that I would probably ask, um, uh, more or less the area of attention that you actually studied. So do you
Yeah.
think that you have, I guess, studied all of attention, or is there still more to go?
It's a great question because at some level, before I started studying the topic of mindfulness training, which we will certainly talk about, I was what I would consider to be a basic attention researcher, meaning my interest was in the basic mechanisms, basic brain mechanisms. How is this system organized? In what ways are brain regions working together to actualize it? What are the different subsystems, processes, etc.? I was very satisfied with that. And I actually thought we were starting to get a very strong handle on how attention works. Like I was feeling great about the field. And it was pretty new, right? Around 50 years or so of solid, what we call cognitive neuroscience, where we're connecting important cognitive functions to brain function. But then I, at some point, actually right around the time my son was quite young, experienced my own sort of crisis of attention.
Mm.
And then I looked to my field and I was like, we don't know anything about how to help people when they have their own crisis of attention. And then I was like, there's a whole other world here that needs to be explored, which, at least in the way that I think about it now, is the new science of attention. And for sure, we're in our infancy of that whole area.
Mm. So let's dive into attention and mindfulness for a
Yeah.
moment. And I want my audience to really understand which side of the brain, firstly, attention actually is involved with. And is mindfulness, is that what you're talking about as a whole, or is there something more to it than that?
Well, we can definitely talk through what even mindfulness means, because now it's such a buzzword that we might not even, when you say it and when I say it, we might mean very different things.
Yep.
But just to say the whole reason that, so I described my own sort of crisis of attention, and just to unpack what that was, essentially I felt incredibly distracted. I felt super preoccupied and like I wasn't really here. And one of the kind of pivotal moments for me was I was reading my son, he was probably like not even 3 at that point, a bedtime story, a book I'd probably read 100 times. Like I knew this book. Like I could probably recite it. If I closed my eyes, I could recite it back to you. But at some point during it, he like stopped me, put his little hand, he's sitting in my lap, put his hand on stopped me from reading it, and he asked me a question about it. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I was like, I don't know what he's referring to. He's referring to an image of the character in the book on the page. But I was on autopilot, serious autopilot. And
Mm.
this was something that I was supposedly doing because I love to do it. Of course, I love my child and I'm spending this time with him because I thought it was valuable. But if I'm not there, even if I'm physically there, what's the use? What's the
Yeah.
point of any of it? Right. And so the crisis for me became, how do I become more embodied? How do I actually experience paying attention moment by moment in my life? That's where my own home field and 50 years of research could not help me. There was nothing
Mm.
that could guide me. In fact, it wasn't even the kind of terrain that was discussed at all.
Mm.
At the same time, in my own lab, we were doing studies where we were finding um, that attention is not only powerful, it can recalibrate, like I said, the entirety of the way the brain functions, including our perception, decision making, etc., mood. But what we were finding is that it was super easy to mess it up. And the kinds of things that were messing it up, which I ended up realizing, oh my gosh, that's the same thing that's messing me up, were things like stress, threat, negative mood, forcing yourself to multitask. These were all things that were kind of draining out attentional resources to the point where people were not functioning well, and reliably they would fail on very simple tasks of attention.
Mm.
So mindfulness from a laboratory perspective entered the scene because I was like, we got to find a solution. I mean, stress, threat, poor mood, these are part of the human condition. I happen to be experiencing that, but I'm not the only one. Most people are experiencing this. And for certain professions, like think of emergency services people, or we work with, for example, active duty military, this is not just simply the ups and downs of life. This is the professional milieu in which we require that people can work at their best under very, very difficult circumstances.
Mm.
So that's the orientation I take toward mindfulness training. I would say personally, I was a skeptic. I didn't even really understand the word. I thought it was some weird new agey thing that I would not want anything to do with. And frankly, I had a lot of sort of cultural baggage against it, being an Indian woman. Like, that's great for my parents, but no, thank you. I'm a Western trained scientist. We'll do the serious stuff.
Mm.
So just to say that it's not something obvious, and it entered my lab for a very specific reason, to solve, or at least attempt to investigate whether it solved a potential vulnerability of this very powerful brain system.
Mm. Doing this podcast, it's obvious that I've got to pay a lot of attention. I've got to be present. I've got to focus in, and I've got to try and think of questions ahead of time most of the time when I'm doing organic conversations. And I have had a couple of times where I've kind of had like these brain farts where I've just lost it. And I've always been curious, why is there something wrong with my brain there? Or is it more or less the result of stress? Because nothing goes on in the brain. It's just, I just don't have anything going on.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I'm curious, why is that?
That the
It's just
experience,
blank.
like there's just nothing there.
It's just completely blank.
There's nothing there. Oh gosh. Well, first of all, I feel your pain, and you're younger than me, but it's happened more and more. Welcome to my world.
Oh dear.
It's a very natural part of healthy aging, actually. But we could call it brain blanking or whatever. But there's many reasons this type of stuff can happen that are part of our normal functioning. So let's just start with, like, there's nothing organically wrong with your brain. I'm sure you're healthy, and it can definitely happen to all of us. Oftentimes, it's not even that there's nothing there; it's that we've been hijacked away from whatever the mental content was. And then we kind of look back to, what was I thinking about? It's gone.
Mm.
Like we can't come back to what the intended target was. And we have this so often. Like, I'm sure you walked into a room like stealthily, right? Like, and then you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing here. What did I come in here for? Right?
Yeah.
Very common. And it probably what happened in the time that you decided to take a walk and you actually got to the room is that you were having 1,000 other thoughts, and it just knocked out whatever was in the front of your working memory so that it wasn't available to you. And I bet probably got halfway down the hall and like, oh yeah, right. It's a very common things the brain does. And it's not that there's organic failures, it's that the brain is a battlefield, that content is constantly under a competitive state. So every thought you have, every emotion that arises, and by the way, this is just all internal, right? And then let's add to that our phones and our social media feeds. There's constant competition for a very precious and very limited brain resource. And when that competition results in a failure to get us the content we want, we've experienced that as sort of a blankness.
I just want to understand this more clearly. So you're saying that me having those brain farts are actually a healthy sign of aging? Because I was worried that it'd be early onset Alzheimer's or dementia at my age of 25.
I mean, I'm not a clinician. I can't decide if you have any problems, but my sense is you're within the normal range of behavior, and it's the normal human experience to have this happen. And frankly, it can happen more often under certain stressful or preoccupying circumstances. And for you, if you forgot something in the middle of a sentence, you'll be okay. Nothing's grave is going to happen to you. Even if you walk to a room and forget, in 2 seconds you can go back. What I was interested in is what to do for people so that moments like that, what we might call distractibility or mind wandering or mind blanking in some cases, when that happens often, and when that happens when it is consequential, almost life or death, then you got to really take a look at it.
Yeah.
And so let's put the blanking to the side, because there's a lot of interesting reasons for that, and just talk more about maybe the topic of mind wandering. And it gets back to your question regarding mindfulness and why mindfulness and what is it, etc. So just to say, it often happens that the things that our brain does that are so awesome and the result of our evolutionary advantages can also become, the same things can become kryptonite for us.
Yep.
And that happens to be the case when we talk about this very important capacity we have called mental time travel.
Mm-hmm.
And so mental time travel is actually sort of the pinnacle of brain evolution, right? We can transport ourselves not only in time, but we can transport ourselves into other people's minds. Like if we take somebody else's perspective, we've actually traveled into their body, are looking out of their eyes and trying to see the universe from their perspective. So those are very powerful capacities and very useful, right? So when we think about mental time travel within our own mind, it might be rewinding the mind to an episode that has occurred before, some past experience, and you're reflecting on it like, oh, last time I had this problem, I did this. Or you're fast forwarding so that you're planning the next thing, or just like you were saying, even planning before you host a podcast, you've thought ahead and you're planning ahead. Very, very powerful thing to do. And by the way, when we do that, our attention is actually in that moment. When you're in the past, your attention is in the past. It's within the simulated experience of your mind reliving and unpacking that memory of the past. So it's not just that our mind is going back. When I say our mind is going back, it's that a memory is emerging and our attention is now transported to that moment. Well, it ends up that under high stress or demanding circumstances, or there's just too much going on, too much distractibility, when we end up having those mental time travel moments, it's not just a productive reflection of the past or a productive planning for the future, but it's like bad.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, it's we end up like ruminating and reliving and regretting events when we think about the past. It's not only, oh, this happened before. It's like, that's so terrible it happened. Why did it happen? Why did I say this, right? That inner loop, sometimes I refer to it as sort of the loop of doom, where we're just we're rehashing the same content. It's going nowhere. We're not solving any problems. Same thing for the future. We're catastrophizing and worrying and kind of caught in a simulated reality of our own making that frankly, hasn't happened yet, but may never happen. We're just making it up. So now it's a real problem for our attention, because not only do we feel terrible and we're not solving any problems, but we are spending out this very precious brain resource of attention, and it's not serving us, because as we're getting temporally hijacked and our attention's moving around, we're missing out on what's going on right now. And typically the present moment demands, especially if it's a high stress circumstance, aren't going to go away. So this is where we want a solution in which we can train our mind to show up in the present moment on demand, so that we can actually experience the moment to moment unfolding of our lives. And that's very hard to do by default, because it ends up that this mental time traveling business that we've been talking about happens about 50% of our waking experience. Our attention is not in the task at hand.
No, it's so easy. And I've noticed this as well. It's so easy to look at all the what ifs, and to, like, when you walk down the street, you're constantly thinking about what that person is thinking about you, how you walk, how you look, all these sorts of things. And it's amazing how your brain does that. And I've always been curious, where does that start? Is it more or less when you're just a kid? Because I don't remember that happening when I was a kid. I don't think I really cared. Or was it when I went through puberty or adolescence and started forming ideas of the world? Is that your experience when you're doing this sort of research from where it started?
Yeah, just to say that the thing you're talking about is essentially we are preoccupied by others' perceptions of us. Our mind may move, like when we're doing our mind traveling, we're moving into the mind of somebody else and they're judging us. It's like we may judge ourselves, but now other people are judging us and we're preoccupied about that, right? So it's this proliferation of distracting content that isn't about getting to where you need to go when you're walking, or even what you might anticipate will happen wherever you arrive if you're meeting friends or whatever. It's sort of this almost, definitely useless content, because it's not helping you, and it actually may preoccupy you to do useful things. So if your question is, why do we do that? Why does our mind wander at all? That's a really good question, right? Because the first thing I'll say, given that I just told you it happens 50% of our waking moments, is not happening by accident. The brain does not do anything, really. It's a very metabolically efficient organ. If half of our energy is being spent on this kind of stuff, it's got to have a purpose.
Yeah.
And so now we want to think through, well, why would it happen? What's the evolutionary pressures that led to it? And most of the time, probably it's not problematic. It's probably useful. Like all those kinds of things have to come into play. So let's just kind of think back to our evolutionary ancestors, because frankly, the brain we have right now as human beings is an evolutionary success story. Like we are the result of a lot of good results, right? Everybody that's in our ancestral line made it to the point of reproducing, at least, so that we can be here. And that's no small feat. So one thing to think about with regard to mind wandering is what would happen if your attention didn't wax and wane. Like, what would that feel like? You'd go somewhere, you'd focus on something. Like, let's say our ancient ancestors are at a watering hole, right? Early mammals, they want to drink water. They go to the watering hole. Oh, great, I see water. They're there. They're focused on drinking. Everything else becomes completely absent to them because they're just focused on the water. Well, it's not going to be too long before they're going to be eaten, right? I mean, you aren't paying attention to your surroundings. A predator will come by and you will become lunch. So just having a little bit of a wavering mind will help you sample the environment, ensure that the goal you have in mind is being honored, but also that you're aware of your surroundings itself. And then now take that to kind of modern day or more evolved, closer to our current day brain. It's very helpful, as we just talked about, to be able to time travel and mind travel. These are very useful things and really a sign of our planful, evolved brain. So attentional cycling, attentional wavering, distractibility, this is actually a good thing. The times that we get into trouble is when there is something else to do and we can't get ourselves to be present in that moment. When these loop of doom scenarios where we're just stuck in rumination or worry and we can't get ourselves out of it, that's when it becomes a real problem. And so that's sort of the good news is this is the nature of the brain. There's nothing wrong, except when there's something wrong and it feels bad.
Yeah.
And then sort of the better news that I'm really interested in pursuing is, well, are there training modalities? And the answer is yes, there are training modalities where we can actually train our brain to show up in the here and the now. And that's what mindfulness actually is. I mean, oftentimes I'll talk about mindfulness as keeping that, if you think about an MP3 player with rewind and fast forward, it's really keeping the button right on play and doing that in a very particular way so that we're paying attention to our present moment experience without what I'd call mental elaboration or reactivity. So we're not telling a story about what's happening. We're just experiencing it. And that lack of elaboration and that lack of reactivity allows us a steadiness that gives us more information about the raw data of what's occurring. And when we do that, we're more likely to be able to solve problems and tackle challenges than if we're lost in a distracted and stressed mind.
There's a lot to unpack there. I want to go, you mentioned towards the very beginning of this conversation, we can increase the motor neurons in our brain. And I find that very, very interesting, actually. How can we, here's going to be the big question. So we'll take it one bit at a time. How can we do that? How can we start taming our brain that is wandering in the first place? And what are some things that we can start doing from the very start?
Okay, great question. That's sort of the entire motivation of why I wrote the book, because what I realized is we were doing studies with these incredibly high stress, high demand groups. We were finding a suite of mindfulness practices that we were offering as brain training, and they were benefiting. And they were benefiting not just like in general, they were benefiting during pre-deployment training or even deployment itself. Or if it was elite athletes, it was during pre-season training. If it was students, it was during the academic semester. So this is consequential because the bad news that we actually learned was all those things I was telling you about earlier: stress, threat, poor mood. If people experience those over a protracted period of time, let's say 4 to 8 to, 14, 15 weeks, could be months. When we bring them into the lab and we test their attention, over the course of that period of time, their attention gets worse. So it truly is the case that for a student, for example, their attentional capacity is lower at the end of the semester than at the beginning of the semester. And now what do you have to do? Write your final papers, right? So, or think about the case of a soldier. I mean, you're preparing for deployment. Now you're in a war zone and you have less attention than you did before you left. So this is what I mean by consequential. And part of the motivation I had in wanting to now bring this to more people is like, they're not the only ones. We're all experiencing these stresses and pressures. And by the way, we happen to be in a global pandemic where I know that, for example, in Australia, there's been quite a long period of lockdown. And so anyway, point is, this is part of our current human experience. And if we are experiencing cognitive fog because of the level of demand, why don't we start training? So then the next question becomes, just like you said, okay, what do I do? What's the training regime? And this actually requires us, and we should talk about it a little bit, of like understanding what attention actually is.
Mm.
Because what we've talked about so far is kind of a general term, probably if I didn't start unpacking it, we'd use the term and we'd probably mean something like focus. And
Yeah.
focus is certainly a part of it, but that's not the full scope of what attention is. So maybe first let's talk about what it is, and then I can tell you why it is that particular mindfulness training practices can help.
Let's do that.
Okay. So the first one's easy, focus. So that's a brain system called attentional orienting. And I like to use the metaphor of focus as like a flashlight. So, or a torch, let's say. And I know that people use the term torch in other parts of the country or world. So essentially, wherever you direct that torch, you're going to have privileged access to information. If you're in a darkened path, that's a really useful lifeline, right? You get crisp, clear information. You won't fall on a rock or trip on a branch or whatever. And we can decide how we're going to direct it. So I can point the flashlight, I can direct it. I can actually direct it not only to the external environment, but I can direct it to the internal environment. So right now, if I said, direct your attention to the sensations at the bottoms of your feet, like, you can do that. You probably were not thinking about your feet before I said it, but once I said that, yes, you could say, oh, it feels kind of cool or clammy or whatever the heck is happening. But we can willfully do that. But the other thing about the flashlight that's really important is it gets pulled as well.
Mm.
So if you're on that darkened path and you hear some kind of rustling behind you, soon enough, your attention is going to snap and your flashlight, literal torch, is going to move to where you think you heard the sound from. That happens all the time. So our attention can be directed and it can be magnetically pulled. But the main feature is it's narrow and limited. So it's not everything. It's just a small amount of stuff. And that's really why we developed it, because we needed to be able to subsample a part of the world for more clarity and access. But that's not the full story about attention. There's two other systems. So just to briefly talk about those, the exact opposite of a flashlight and this narrowing is something I call the floodlight. So just like, I've got a floodlight on top of my garage door, like it's just broad and receptive. It's just whatever appears there. And what that is doing is essentially allowing whatever emerges in the present moment, whether it's a raccoon in my neighborhood or whatever, is what's happening right now. And we call that the brain's alerting system. The brain's alerting system does not want to narrow, because you never know what's going to show up and you've got to be ready for anything. So it's broad, receptive. It doesn't privilege some information over others. That what it really privileges is the present moment, like right now. So the floodlight's a really helpful thing to think about. And then the third system is advantaging our information processing based on our goals. So what is my goal right now, right? So like right now, it's look at Jay's face, ensure that I understand the questions he's asking. My goal is not to look on my phone from, another blue scarf. Like, it's not that, it's this. So everything I do will be guided by the goal I currently have. And what I call this system, well, it's called formally the executive functioning system. And it's just like the executive of a company. You are to ensure that everything's happening according to plan, but you're not doing every little thing. You're just doing the one thing, et cetera. So anyway, so all three of those systems exist. They're important. They're quite different from each other. And mindfulness practices end up touching on each of those, exercising each of those, which actually is part of keeping them strong and healthy and providing us the opportunity to use them in the moment when we need it.
Wow. And this is exactly what you unpack in your new book, Peak Mind?
You got it.
Wow.
But I know our time is kind of short, but I can give one quick example of how we might do this if it's helpful.
Please do. Yes.
Okay. So one very, I would say probably the most common example of a mindfulness practice is something I call it the find your flashlight practice, because it's like this thing we carry around with us, our focus, half the time we don't know where it is. So the instruction is very straightforward, and you can do it. I recommend working up to about 12 minutes a day, but you can do it right now, even as I'm talking about it, 30 seconds. It's a very simple thing. What it gives you by the end is like, where your attention is in this moment. Now it could get yanked away in the next moment, but you're practicing knowing where your flashlight is directed. So
Mm.
what we do to simulate just being in the present moment is we use a sensory experience that is unfolding in real time. And that really only happens moment by moment. And that happens to be breath related sensations. Like you
Mm.
can't save up the breath. You can't think about it for later. It's unfolding right now. We're breathing, right? And it's sort of a nice target for our attention because it has that quality of present centeredness and shifting nature. So the target for a mindfulness or find your focus practice is breath related sensations. Now, that doesn't mean think about your breath or control your breath. It's just pay attention to your breath
Yeah.
and be very, very granular. Take that flashlight and like almost think of it as a laser pointer. What's the most prominent breath related sensation I'm having right now? That's where I'm going to point that laser pointer.
Mm.
So some people, it could be the tip of your nose or maybe just something in your throat or your chest moving up and down. Whatever it is for you, you're going to commit that for the short period of time you're going to do the practice, that flashlight is going to be pointed to that breath related sensation. That's the target.
Mm.
Soon enough, you do this, you're focusing on breath related sensations, your mind will wander. Like I said, that the default is 50% of them are waking moments that's wandering. So the next step of the instruction is when you notice that your mind has wandered away from those breath related sensations, simply redirect your attention back. So in that short practice, we've used our flashlight to point at the target. We're using our floodlight to check out what's going on. And our executive control is saying, stay on task. You said,
Mm.
this breath related sensation. So it's such a nice, easy way to think about exercising all of those systems. And then we're getting more and more familiar with the landscape of our own mind. And it's not about becoming excellent breath followers. It is about being able to use these capacities when it's not about following your breath, but noticing in the context of a conversation. Oh, my mind wandered away. Bring it back. Or writing a report or reading a book. Like when your mind wanders away, most of the time, we're super unaware
Yep.
that we're gone away. And there's no chance of bringing it back if we're not even sure where it is.
Yeah. I love how you mentioned the flashlight principle or tool that people can use. What I love doing as well is I blink twice and then I breathe in and out slowly. And that the blinking twice is like a trigger for me if I am thinking about a negative thought or if I've got some emotion that I don't like and I want to remove it. The blink twice gets me in that state of where I need to change it. And then I breathe in and out. So the like you mentioned, the chest going up and down. So that movement. And I repeat it over and over and over again until that negative loop is no longer there and until I'm back where I need to be or where I want to be, actually. So that works for me. It might not work for other people because there's a myriad of other strategies, but I just thought I'd say that because I like the light bulb analogy. That's so cool.
It's very, here's what I would say. It's great if that works. If you can blink twice, focus on your breath, and that is able to allow whatever negative or unpleasant content to kind of drift away. That's wonderful. For many people, it may not work because the negative content, you have to remember what is feeding it. And that's where our attention also matters. It's not that a thought popped up. It's that we're poking at the thought. We're continuing to have the thought. We're elaborating on the thought. So part of what we're doing by saying flashlight right here is we're not fueling the flashlight going somewhere else to proliferate and give a life to that negative content.
Yeah.
So I would argue that, not argue, but I would say to you, maybe the reason the negative thoughts kind of dissipate is because you're so then able to keep all of those attentional resources of your flashlight close to the sensations of the breath.
Yeah.
So it just sort of dissolves and dissipates. And it's very important to remember, you don't want to be pushing anything away or suppressing, because frankly, that actually is a form, paradoxically, of paying attention to it.
Yeah.
If I say, don't think of a white bear, as I'm probably sure everybody's heard, I can guess what kind of color bear you're thinking about right now, right? And if you say to yourself over and over, don't think of the white bear, don't think of the white bear. What color bear? So it doesn't work. And so what you want to do is figure out a way to know your attention well enough and to practice having some relative amount of both control over it and receptivity so that it can do the thing it needs to do and not fight against it, not battle further for where your mind goes.
Yeah. I think having a lot of tools in your toolkit is very, very helpful. So thank you so much for sharing your powerful one. I know it's going to help so many people. I know our time is running to an end, so I really do appreciate you taking the time to be here today. I do want to ask you, before I do ask the final two questions, where can people get a copy of your new book? It's called Peak Minds. It comes out October 19th officially, which is pretty cool. It's coming out, I believe, in Australia, the UK, India, America as well. All these great countries. So make sure to go and get a copy of it right now. But where can they connect with you, Amishi, and buy a copy of your book?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. It's easy to find me if you can remember my name, Amishi, AMISHI.com. And there they can find about our lab's research and about the book, and really to just say that the book is my way of trying to make as accessible and beneficial to as many people as possible the tools that our laboratory-based studies have found help a lot of people.
It's an amazing book. I have no doubt that it's going to go absolutely crazy. So well done. And thank you so much for writing it. My second last question for you, Amishi, is what do you love the most about yourself and your story?
Oh, wow. I think what I love about myself and my story is that through the process of having crises, like a crisis of attention, I've come to know myself more and kind of have a sense of sort of kindness and friendliness toward myself. And I think that as I've kind of learned to be my own best cheerleader, in some sense, supporter, and friend, I think I've become more effective in everything I've tried to do in my life.
My final question for you, this is my all-time favorite question I ask everyone at the end of all my conversations. It's a hypothetical one, but I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you've been able to reach the age of 100. All your friends and your family have decided to put together a film for you of everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done. I know, don't worry. And we'll just call it magic for the sake of argument. But they've been able to get it and show it to you on your 100th birthday. What do you want that film to say and to show about your life?
Probably very much like what I've tried to express in this book, is that part of the journey of our lives is to not have the notion that we won't have challenge, but that we can cultivate a better capacity to know our own mind and to train our own mind so that no matter what, we've advantaged our ability to meet challenge fully. And that doesn't just mean challenge, by the way, to embrace joy fully, to have adventure fully, to have curiosity fully. So the peak isn't about sort of some successory of being on a mountaintop. So I don't see those kind of images in this, but it's that quiet sense of fullness, which I don't know how they're going to capture in a video, but I will feel it.
It's a great send-off message. Dr. Amishi, thank you so much for your time today, your energy, your story, your wisdom, and your advice. I know it's going to help so many people. I know we could go on and on and on to unpack all this amazing stuff. But thank you so much for your time today and for joining me on this Storybox podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.